Hello, my name is John Olbrantz, and I'm the Mary Beth Collins Director of the Hallie Museum of Art at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this series of 4 virtual lectures being presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Forgotten Stories, Northwest Public Art of the 1930s, which continues through March 27, 2021 at the Hallie Museum of Art. Organized by curator Margaret Bullock for the Tacoma Art Museum, Forgotten Stories is the first major exhibition to celebrate the bounty of artwork created in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana under the New Deal federal art projects in the 1930s. Because of the current coronavirus pandemic and restrictions on social gatherings, and in order to help contextualize the exhibition, we've invited 4 humanities scholars to deliver virtual lectures on New Deal art, a history of the Depression, American literature in the 1930s, and science and technology during the Depression. The 4-part virtual lecture series, the first such lecture series that we've undertaken, has been made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency, and we're most grateful to them for their belief in our ability to carry out such an ambitious and technologically innovative series of lectures. On a local level, I want to thank Hallie Museum of Art Education Curator Elizabeth Garrison for organizing and coordinating the virtual lectures, and the staff of Allied Video Productions here in Salem for filming and editing the lecture series and getting the various lectures ready for broadcast. Today's speaker is Ellen Eisenberg. Ellen has taught in the History Department at Willamette University since 1990, where she holds the Dwight and Margaret Lear Chair in American History. She received her BA degree in American Studies from Carleton College in Minnesota and her PhD degree in History from the University of Pennsylvania. Ellen teaches courses on American and African American history since the Civil War, American social history, American Jewish history, American immigration history, the 1960s, and Reconstruction. Since the mid-1990s, Ellen has written 4 monographs on Jews in the West, as well as a number of articles and book chapters. Her book, the first to cry down injustice, Western Jews and Japanese Removal During World War II, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist in 2008. Please welcome our speaker, Ellen Eisenberg.
It's a pleasure being here as part of the Hallie Museum of Art's Forgotten Stories, Northwest Public Art in the 1930s, and to have an opportunity to talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal. In my classes, I come back again and again to the Depression and the New Deal because, much like the Civil War, the Great Depression is a pivot point in American history. When I teach courses on recent American history and politics, it seems that everything brings us back to the Great Depression and to the New Deal that was the policy response to the crisis. The period is pivotal for many reasons. Most obviously, our modern understandings of the role of the federal government and our economy are rooted in this era. This connection became particularly obvious to my students in the spring of 2020, when we were studying the New Deal just as Congress was debating the shape of a federal stimulus in response to our current economic crisis brought on by COVID-19. Even in non-COVID times, I often make connections between the economic understandings that emerge from the New Deal and our everyday expectations about government's role in the economy. From the minimum wage to the 40-hour work week, from our social security system to the insurance of our deposits at the bank, all go back to the New Deal, as do our expectations about the federal role in everything from farm production to the stock market regulation, from housing programs to support for the arts and sciences. At the same time that I point these achievements out to students, we also recognize some of the ways in which some of these same programs reinforced and furthered the racial inequities that are so much a part of current conversations about structural racism. Today, I'll provide an overview of this history. I'll begin with a discussion of the causes and extent of the Great Depression. I'll then turn to the wide-ranging programs and innovative New Deal efforts designed to spur a recovery, to reform the economy, to prevent future depressions, and address longer-term economic issues, and to relieve the suffering of ordinary Americans through direct aid and work programs. And finally, I will highlight some of the ways in which these programs reinforced and institutionalized racial inequality. So when we think about the Depression, we usually think about the crash in October of 1929, specifically about Black Thursday, October 24th of 1929, when a panic began because of a sharp drop in stock prices. Between Black Thursday and the following Tuesday, the 29th of October 1929, the stock market lost nearly 50% of its value, 47%. The stock market crash triggered a major financial collapse. The GNP dropped from $104 billion in 1929, almost by half, to $59 billion in 1932. Bank failures started happening very rapidly. There were 659 just in the latter part of 1929, over 1,300 in 1930, and by 1931-32, they were coming at 200 a month. In less than 2 years, farm prices fell by nearly 60%, and industrial production fell off by more than 50%. Wages dropped by more than 60% in manufacturing and about 40% in white-collar occupations. And of course, unemployment. Unemployment reached 12 million in 1932, roughly 25% of the workforce. And with so many people out of work, of course, people weren't able to make their rent payments, their mortgage payments. Soon people were set adrift, homeless. Shanty towns started to emerge on the outskirts of cities, dubbed Hoovervilles after the sitting president. There were soup lines in American cities. It was a total disaster. So often people want to know, and my students ask me, well, how could this happen, especially right after the 1920s? The 1920s are known as this period of great indulgence, consumption, and so on, the roaring 20s, when everybody had access to so much more. We really associate the 1920s with good economic times. We think of consumerism. We think of an atmosphere of living for the moment and material fulfillment, even indulgence. In fact, the 1920s were such a time in many ways. What had been luxuries, whether we're talking about cars or vacuum cleaners or just having electrical power in one's house, these things had once been luxuries, but they become standard expectations as modern manufacturing led to an increase in productivity and doubled industrial output that made all of these former luxuries affordable to the majority of Americans. These were also the years when a consumer society that we would recognize began. In order to fuel this consumption, advertising was used, not just to make people aware of products that they needed, but to create demand for goods that no one ever had thought they needed before. And so there's a real shift in terms of consumer expectations. Take fashion. It starts to change much more rapidly. And we have this with us to today. I would not wear the same clothes to class on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, right? People might start to look at me funny if I was constantly wearing the same clothes. Whereas in the 19th century, it was fairly common for people to have just a couple of sets of clothes, maybe for work and for church on Sunday. The same sorts of things happened with other consumer goods. This is the period in which car manufacturers started to make cars in different colors and update the models much more rapidly. So if you wanted to stay in fashion, right, you would purchase goods much more frequently and change what you wear much more frequently. The increased consumption was in part a product of rising wages of ordinary workers. So if you think of Ford's $5 day, the idea here was that workers on an assembly line at a car plant should be able to earn enough money to become consumers of those very cars that they were making. It was also a product of newly available credit, as stores, car manufacturers, and so on created new opportunities to buy goods on layaway or on payment plans to pay for things over time with credit. The same kind of consumption also seeped into leisure, which really became an industry for the first time in this period. Leisure became a commodity to be purchased, and consumption itself became a leisure activity. Most obviously, this is the period when shopping became a leisure activity, something that you do for fun, right? Also, many more leisure activities were things that one purchases. In the 19th century and earlier in the 20th century, in leisure time, the family might have sat around the parlor and listened to someone play piano or sing together or play cards. Now people were going to the movies, to dance halls, to amusement parks, to arcades, and on vacations other than going to see family and stay with them. vacations purely for amusement. So there was this incredible boom in consumption, incredibly heightened expectations about what ordinary Americans should own and what they would have. And it really felt to many people like good times were here to stay. But the reality was that the foundations underlying the Roaring '20s, underlying that prosperity, were very unstable in multiple sectors. First, the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector was depressed throughout the 1920s, despite all of the veneer of the boom. Mechanization and other innovations led to increasing production, which of course led to plummeting prices. As farmers tried to compensate for those low prices, they grew even more, setting off a downward spiral. In the industrial sector, as productivity increased, wages flowed disproportionately to the top. This was exacerbated by pro-business policies of a series of Republican administrations in the 1920s. The aim was to cut taxes at the top in order to encourage investment, right? But in an economy dependent on consumer spending, ordinary Americans' pocketbooks were expanding, but not quickly enough to keep up with all that was available. By 1929, it was clear that there was an overproduction problem in the manufacturing sector too. There just wasn't the consumer demand to buy all that was being produced. And finally, the foundations in the financial sector were particularly unstable. The surging stock market, rather than reflecting the real values of the stocks that people were purchasing, was just one of several investment bubbles fueled by speculation and by the desire for quick gains. The system allowed, and it actually even encouraged, people to buy on the margins. This meant that if I were interested in buying stocks, I could go to a bank or a stockbroker, and I could put down 25% and borrow the rest with the stock itself as collateral. That's great, as long as the stock that I buy goes up and up and up. I can sell it in a year, repay what I've borrowed, and still pocket the profit. But when the prices of stocks plummet, the stocks are worthless, I'm unable to repay my debt, and of course, the bank or stockbroker holding the stock as collateral is also out of luck. And banks, as what I just said it suggests, banks too were engaged in speculative investments. And when the bubble burst, people run to withdraw their money from the banks, and the money just isn't there. So when the crash comes, confidence collapses. Both consumers and corporations contract their spending. In the case of corporations, that means throwing people out of work, trimming their workforces. And it leads to a downward spiral. Demand drops, leading more factories to curtail production, laying off more people. Those people then can no longer afford to consume what they had been, and that further reduces demand. So we get this downward spiral. So now I'd like to turn to the responses to the Great Depression. Based on the conventional economic wisdom at the time, the market runs itself naturally. So the market was considered a natural entity, right? You shouldn't interfere with it, just in the same way you shouldn't interfere with Mother Nature. And depressions were considered part of a market cycle. It was expected that the market goes up and down, and you just need to ride it out. Government intervention is not only unnatural, but potentially dangerous. And in addition, there's a very fervent belief that the federal budget absolutely must be balanced. Now, the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, who had been elected just the November before, he's elected in November of 28, the crash comes in October of 29, and he is no Grinch. Right? He had actually coordinated the food relief efforts for Europe after World War I. But he's working within the conventional economic wisdom of the time. And he is very reluctant to go beyond that, to exercise some sort of more forceful federal role, and certainly very hesitant to do any kind of deficit spending. So he tries to use the powers of persuasion. He tries to urge business leaders to maintain wages and employment, which they're not very able to do given the collapse in demand. He further cuts taxes for the wealthiest and for businesses to encourage investment. But who would really want to invest given the uncertainties of the market? He urges banks to make business loans, but again, this doesn't seem to be a winning proposition. And he urges local governments to set up public works projects to put people back to work. But they don't have the funds to do this. And finally, he offers assistance in coordinating voluntary relief, because the vision at the time was that any sort of relief of poverty should come through voluntary efforts, through philanthropy. But of course, those people donating to philanthropic causes have also taken a hit. And so charities are faced with an unprecedented number of people in need and severely reduced means to meet that need. So Hoover's efforts come to no avail. The crisis ends up worsening in each remaining year of his presidency. As I said, the shanty towns that are constructed end up being called Hoovervilles after him. And on top of that general crisis, in farming, the rains fail across the middle section of the country for several years beginning in 1930, setting off the Dust Bowl, which leads to a huge surge in farm foreclosures as people's farms just dry up and blow away. And so people are set adrift. And of course, this leads to the famous migration, typically from the Grapes of Wrath. We think of from Oklahoma to California, but it's actually a much broader section of the middle of the country. In 1932, bonus marchers, 10,000 World War I veterans, march on Washington to demand passage of a bill to approve a bonus for them. And Hoover orders that they be driven out of town. So finally, this is 1932, an election year. Hoover is running for re-election, and he moves to some sort of more substantial federal response, all the time fearing that it's going to lead to socialism, right? He starts something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provides loans to financial institutions such as banks and insurance companies. He provides loans to save private businesses, and he also provides grants to state and local governments so that they'll be able to create public works and hire people to come and work. However, by this point, the people have lost their faith in Hoover, and Roosevelt was elected overwhelmingly. Franklin Roosevelt did not have a clear plan. He emphasizes the idea that he will take action. Right? There's no specific action that he talks about beyond the idea of federal works programs, but he promises boldness and innovation. And it's such a contrast with Hoover's insistence that we just have to wait for the cycle to right itself. Roosevelt is vague on specifics, but he does plow ahead very quickly. And of course, a vote for Roosevelt is largely a vote against Hoover, and a vote for Roosevelt's promise to do something. And Democrats win a resounding victory, majorities, clear majorities, veto-proof majorities in both houses. Roosevelt actually wins 57.4% of the popular vote to Hoover's less than 40%. He wins 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. And the New Deal that he offered was so popular that his victory would be even greater in 1936. In 1936, Roosevelt wins over 60% of the popular vote, and he wins 523 out of 531 electoral votes, all but 8. So what is his program? When historians talk about the New Deal, we talk about it in terms of 3 major kind of buckets, but they're overlapping buckets: recovery, reform, and relief. When we talk about recovery, we talk about programs designed to get the economy going again. It's interesting that many people feared, as did Hoover, that federal intervention would lead to socialism. But in many ways, the recovery efforts are what save capitalism. They save private industry. The idea is to get workers paid and get corporations making profits again, with the goal of increasing both consumer spending and the confidence that fuels investment. So the problem that recovery is dealing with is a problem largely of overproduction. In both industry and in agriculture, there's not enough consumer demands for the supply of goods being produced. It makes it no longer worthwhile for farmers or for factories to produce goods. A very vivid example of this is the idea that a farmer in Iowa growing corn actually was better off burning the corn for heat, right, than bringing it to market, because the cost of growing it and bringing it to market far exceeded what he could get for it on the market. So the solution in both sectors is to raise prices by controlling production. In industry, Roosevelt institutes a National Recovery Administration that controls wages and production and labor rules to some extent, and it creates a system in which production is limited and spread among multiple factories, so that workers in different plants, say in the steel industry, for example, the workers in those different plants would each get some work and therefore some ability to support their family and to continue to be consumers. And then with the limited supply of steel or whatever other good being produced, the price would rise, making it worthwhile to produce again and fueling growth. There's a similar idea for agriculture. The Agricultural Adjustment Act pays farmers not to grow and in some cases to plow under their crops. Reducing the supply raises the prices, making it worthwhile again for farmers to begin to produce in a limited fashion with controls in terms of how much each farmer should grow. And in the meantime, the Agricultural Adjustment Act puts money in the pockets of farmers so that they'll be able to support their families and spend. The second area after recovery is reform. Reform are changes to prevent future crashes or depressions and also to shore up capitalism through regulations that curb or humanize the economic system and prevent its worst abuses. For example, under these measures, these reform measures, the banking industry is reformed. Roosevelt announces a holiday, a bank holiday, in which all banks are closed, their books are examined, and then they're reopened with new federal backing under the FDIC system, the same system that if you go to a bank today, you will see the FDIC sticker on the window that tells you that your money in that bank is insured. They also regulate the stock market through the Securities and Exchange Commission, another new entity created by the New Deal to ensure that there's transparency in the stock market, that investors are able to assess what it is that they're buying and what the value is. Part of the reform efforts are also recognition of workers' rights, like the right to unionize. And probably most famously under these efforts is the Social Security system, a system of national pensions and unemployment insurance that we pay into and then can tap either when we're unemployed or when we retire. Finally, these efforts included the establishment of the first federal minimum wage and maximum hour laws. The third area is relief. Relief means relieving the suffering and putting money in the pockets of consumers so that they will spend and help bring the economy back to life. This begins with emergency direct assistance, money paid to people until the work programs could be established. There is the assumption, this is also under the Social Security Act, the assumption of federal responsibility for provision of relief to non-workers. This is what we know today as the welfare system. So people like widows with children were not expected to work, and therefore they would get government assistance. But the cornerstone of relief was the work programs. This is what people remember most about the New Deal. The relief programs enabled people to feed their families and keep a roof over their heads, providing also psychological as well as economic relief and hope. There was a huge range of programs under the work relief umbrella. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps was a public works program that focused specifically on the employment of young men. Ultimately, 2.5 million young men ages 18 to 25, would work under CCC auspices. The CCC was one of a number of programs that employed people for infrastructure work, building dams, roads, parks, other public facilities, trails, bridges, hospitals, you name it. And by 1935, many of these programs were consolidated under the umbrella of the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. The WPA at its peak provided jobs for 3.3 million workers. That was in November of 1938. Now, one of the most massive programs was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, a rural redevelopment program that included recovery in the form of economic development, relief in the form of thousands and thousands of jobs by building and operating dams in a 7-state area in the Tennessee Valley, and also provided electricity, flood control, reclamation, and reforestation. Now, although most people think of blue-collar workers when they think of the New Deal, the WPA also hired a broad array of professionals, from engineers and architects to photographers and social scientists to document the programs. Of particular interest, of course, for us here today are the federal arts programs. These were designed as relief programs that recognized that all sorts of artists were unemployed workers deserving of state assistance. The federal arts programs enabled the government to hire them to create art. The program was also seen as aiding the recovery in that it defined art as a vital tool for uplifting the spirits of the people and inspiring them. And in fact, many of the arts programs explicitly embraced art that was designed to uplift. Finally, the programs also fit the reform category in that they led to a lasting shift in public funding for the arts. And to this day, of course, we expect some level of federal funding of the arts. There were 4 specific federal arts programs. The Federal Writers Project employed about 5,000 writers at its peak, including novelists like Richard Wright, and nonfiction writers who wrote local histories. One of the most interesting of the writers' projects to me as a historian was a project that included people like Zora Neale Hurston, who collected the stories of elderly African Americans who had been born into slavery. By this point, they were in their 80s and 90s, and we have a whole collection of the recordings of these interviews. The Federal Arts Project for the visual arts also employed about 5,000 artists to create public art. The most prominent examples were the post office murals, painted in post offices across the country. But they also organized art exhibits and hired many other artists, many of whom, of course, are represented in the exhibit. Beyond the professional artists, the program also included extensive art instruction. You can see the community center, a local example at Gold Beach, of an art center that was part of this art program, and where there were exhibits as well as art lessons. Another local example from Salem, Oregon, also funded by the Federal Art Project. The Federal Music Project employed 16,000 musicians at its peak and commissioned pieces and public concerts and created ensembles, orchestras, operas, dance bands, etc., providing 131,000 performances and programs to millions of people. And these were often broadcast on the radio, which brought them to millions more people. They also gave music lessons to adults and children across the country. And finally, the Federal Theater Project employed over 15,000 performers at its peak. Over 1,000 performances per month were given during the peak period to over 1 million people. The project produced 1,200 plays over 4 years, introduced the work of 100 new playwrights. And those plays were seen by 30 million people in over 200 theaters, many of them free of charge. The theater program also included a Negro theater unit focused on the work of African American playwrights and in theaters in places like Harlem. Often these were focused on racial themes. There were also several foreign language units in the theater program, including Yiddish, Spanish, and German, and a radio play division. So these examples give a sense of the extent of the works programs, which began in 1933 and extended up until our entry into World War II. Despite all of these programs, it took war production to lead us to full employment and out of the Depression. In fact, during the war, there was full employment plus. There was such a shortage of workers that women were recruited to go into the factories. But as I noted earlier, many of the reform aspects of the New Deal, such as Social Security and the FDIC insurance, remain with us today. So at this point, I'd like to turn to the limits of innovation and talk about some of the ways in which, despite all of these achievements, the New Deal programs reinforced and scaffolded racial inequality. First, I should say that historians are very clear in saying that the Roosevelt administration was more attentive to and inclusive of African Americans than any administration since Grant's, although admittedly this was not a very high bar. Like other Americans, African Americans benefited from New Deal work programs. They were more likely than other Americans to face unemployment even before the 1930s. They were often the last hired and the first fired. But African Americans were particularly hard hit by the Great Depression. African Americans were eligible for the federal works programs, including those for artists and writers, as well as those for manual laborers. And they also benefited from infrastructure projects that provided electricity in the rural South, that upgraded public facilities and housing, and that mitigated floods and erosion. In addition, Franklin Roosevelt, and particularly his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, reached out to the black community, with Roosevelt forming a group of advisors who were often called the Black Cabinet. In fact, it was during the Great Depression that African Americans who were able to vote, meaning mostly those in the North, shifted their loyalty from the Republican Party, where they had been as a legacy of the Civil War, to the Democratic Party. This is the period in time when the majority of African Americans shift over to the Democrats. That said, Roosevelt's policies were limited in what they provided for African Americans and for other people of color in terms of their respect for the color line, their inaction in the face of racial violence, and their reinforcement of existing and creation of new structures of inequality. Although the Democratic Party was, by the 1930s, a party dominated by urban interests and labor in the North, in the South, it was still the party of white supremacy, which it would remain until the Civil Rights era. And Southern Democrats made the maintenance of Jim Crow and the suppression of African Americans their key priority. And Roosevelt needed their support to enact his program. Thus, the New Deal programs largely respected the color line. Jobs typically went to whites first, unemployment and poverty remained higher among people of color, and many works programs, such as the CCC and virtually all of the programs in the South, were segregated. Many had separate Negro divisions, as was the case of the federal theaters program. Moreover, some of the recovery programs actually dramatically harmed people of color. For example, when the Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers not to grow or to plow under their crops, those payments went to land owners who were overwhelmingly white. Agricultural workers, including tenant farmers and sharecroppers, who were far more likely to be people of color, were not provided for in those payments and were set adrift. A second point is the inaction of the administration in the face of racial violence. In addition to failing to challenge segregation, Franklin Roosevelt also failed to speak out in support of one of the African American community's highest priorities, a federal anti-lynching bill. The hope was to make lynching a federal crime. The proposed law promised a way to prosecute lynchers in federal court because it was nearly impossible to charge and convict white murderers of African Americans in Southern courts. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt supported the anti-lynching law, but Roosevelt refused. As he explained to NAACP leader Walter White, "If I come out for the anti-lynching bill now, Southern Democrats will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing. I just can't take the risk." Now, in addition to the failures to challenge the color line and to take a stand against racial violence, the New Deal also reinforced and actually created new structures of racism that serve to further scaffold racial inequality that remain with us today. And here I'll just highlight two of the most significant and lasting of these new structures. These reveal that, as historian Ira Katz-Nelson argues, New Deal programs were part of a program of affirmative action for whites. First, Social Security. Social Security created a system for unemployment and old age insurance, as well as the first system of welfare, a program designed to support poor people, particularly women and children. However, the welfare program, at the insistence of Southern Democrats, was administered through the states, where racialized requirements were used to exclude many people of color. The part of the system that we now call Social Security, the old age pensions, excluded farm workers and domestic jobs, which were overwhelmingly held by African Americans and in the West by Mexican Americans. So when the Social Security Act passed in 1935, 65% of African Americans nationally and between 70 and 80% of those in the South were excluded. They worked in jobs that weren't covered by Social Security. Even when these exclusions were eliminated in the 50s, there was no catching up, because one's Social Security benefits are tied directly to the amount that one pays into the system over a lifetime of work. These same occupations, overwhelmingly held by people of color, were also excluded from minimum wage and maximum hours laws passed during the New Deal. And finally, the Federal Housing Authority. Now, the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, has been hailed, along with the Veterans Administration in the post-war period, with making home ownership possible for millions of working-class Americans by offering low-interest 30-year loans with little money down. In 1930, only about a third of Americans owned their own homes, a figure that doubled by 1960 because of these programs. But few of these houses were available to African Americans, as the federal housing policies embraced segregation as essential to the maintenance of housing values and actually pioneered the practice of redlining, permitting loans only in neighborhoods deemed good investments, and neighborhoods that were minority neighborhoods were automatically not good investments. So through a combination of government and private practices, African Americans and other people of color were not eligible to buy into the suburban levered towns that would expand dramatically after the war, nor were the government-backed loans available for investment in inner-city minority neighborhoods. Thus, a two-pronged federal housing policy emerged. On the one hand, the construction of largely segregated government-provided housing projects in America's cities, and on the other, government-backed low-interest loans that enabled working-class whites to invest in houses, investments that also bought them access to better funded and racially exclusive suburban schools, and that would become the single most important source of the intergenerational wealth white families have been able to pass on to their children and grandchildren. When I teach my survey course on American history again this spring, I will find myself returning again and again to the Great Depression and the New Deal. I'll remind my students of its legacies, of the many ways that the New Deal reforms remain relevant to their lives. I'll remind them that it was the New Deal that brought us the weekend by establishing the standard 5-day work week and 8-hour day. So when they earn overtime, for example, in their 40-hour-a-week job, they can thank the New Deal for the fact that they get overtime pay. I'll remind them that some of that FICA money that is deducted from their paycheck every month will provide eventually for their retirement. With 2020 fresh in their minds, we'll talk about the shift away from classical economic theory to the understanding of deficit spending that led to last year's stimulus checks. And I'll remind them that families that are relying on unemployment during the pandemic are benefiting from yet another New Deal program. But I'll also point back to the New Deal when asked about systemic racism and structural inequality, reminding them that when leaders of the reparations movement make the case for reparations, they talk not only about slavery and the Jim Crow system, but also about the impact of New Deal programs, such as the FHA loan program, on the continuing economic disparities between whites and people of color in modern America.